Scientific Impact Statement, Universal Numbers Group, UN Group, Full Recurrence Architecture. If taken seriously, and especially if independently verified at its strongest measurable layers, the Universal Numbers Group, UN Group, Full Recurrence Architecture would have scientific importance because it proposes that solar eclipse recurrence may be governed by a more layered internal order than standard presentation has yet fully recognized. The doctrine does not merely restate eclipse periodicity. It presents a structured system involving group organization, FMC sequence order, zone placement, metonic routing, observed versus structural distinctions, and a concentrated local symmetry formation in the UN group AGT. In scientific terms, the central significance of the work would lie in its claim that eclipse recurrence is not only periodic, but architecturally organized across multiple linked dimensions of timing, sequence, placement, and relation. One of the first scientific impacts of the UN group architecture would be a renewed focus on the internal structure of eclipse recurrence rather than on eclipse prediction alone. Standard astronomical practice already recognizes that eclipses recur through known cycles such as the Saros. But the UN group doctrine claims that recurrence may have deeper internal organization, not merely a return in time, but a grouped return through ordered sequence, structured landing, and patterned relations between selected eclipse sets. If such an architecture were supported, it would encourage eclipse science to ask not only whether eclipses repeat, but whether their repetition belongs to a larger formal system of organization. That shift alone would be scientifically significant. A second scientific impact would concern the role of FMC sequence order as a structural coordinate. Across the UN group files, FMC appears not as a casual label, but as a repeating sequence backbone linking groups, cycles, and placements. In the broader doctrine, FMC is part of the recurrence architecture of the wheel and metonic chart. In the UN group AGT, FMC again appears as an organizing principle, especially around the special center at Hummer 20. If this shared role were validated, it would imply that eclipse recurrence may contain a sequence logic more formal than ordinary catalog order. Scientifically, that would matter because it would introduce an additional structural variable into the interpretation of eclipse recurrence. The UN group doctrine would also be scientifically important because of its emphasis on spatial landing. In the larger architecture, eclipses are not only said to recur in time. They are said to land in numbered zones, with odd and even systems organized through distinct wheel structures. This is one of the most distinctive scientific claims in the UN group work. If correct, it would imply that eclipse recurrence is not sufficiently described by timing relationships alone, but must also be understood as participation in a structured spatial field. That would enrich scientific interpretation by linking recurrence to positional architecture rather than reducing it to chronology. Another major scientific consequence would be the reevaluation of metonic structure within eclipse recurrence. The UN group metonic material does not treat the metonic cycle as a peripheral calendrical curiosity. It treats it as an internal recurrence engine, expressing repeated 19.024 year links, a visible 1 to 2 3 grouping rhythm, 674 synodic month boundary lines, and the exact 705 synodic months, 57 years relation. If these relations were shown to be structurally relevant to eclipse organization, then the scientific status of metonic recurrence inside eclipse theory would deepen. It would no longer appear as only an associated cycle, but as a more active organizing layer in a larger eclipse architecture. A further scientific impact would come from the doctrine's distinction between the observed layer and the fuller structural layer. The UN group red-green logic claims that some dates exist in present eclipse data, while others belong to the larger structure but are not realized under the accepted framework. Whatever one ultimately concludes about that doctrine, the scientific form of the claim is significant. It introduces a testable distinction between a presently observed recurrence system and a fuller hypothesized recurrence field. That kind of distinction could stimulate new scientific discussion about what counts as a complete description of a recurrent natural system, and whether present data sets sometimes reveal only a partial manifestation of a deeper order. The most ambitious scientific consequence would concern the 12.89 second completion principle. Within the UN group architecture, this principle is not a side observation. It functions as the explanatory key linking the present partial realization of eclipse recurrence to a fuller structure. If that proposition were even partially supported, the scientific implications would be serious. It would mean that one very small difference associated with the draconic month framework may have much larger consequences for how eclipse recurrence is structurally realized. That would not merely add a new interpretive layer to eclipse science. It would raise the possibility that a tiny residual quantity is controlling a major difference between observed recurrence and fuller structural closure. Scientifically, that is the kind of claim that would demand intense scrutiny because of its potential importance. The UN group AGT would likely have especially strong scientific significance as a bounded test case. The full recurrence architecture is large, but the AGT offers a more concentrated structure. 39 eclipses, 20 pairs, 3 waves, duration convergence, zodiacal placement, connector geometry, and digital root relations. That boundedness makes AGT scientifically useful. It provides a discrete internal formation where multiple doctrinal claims can be examined together. If its pair identities, duration relations, and positional symmetries were verified, it would give the broader doctrine a local, highly structured confirmation point. In that sense, the UN group AGT could function scientifically as a bridge between the largest claims of the doctrine and the most manageable verification tasks. Another scientific impact would concern methodology. The UN group files repeatedly distinguish between visual synthesis and computational verification. The doctrine does not merely present diagrams and ask to be trusted. It insists on source files, recomputation, position checks, duration checks, wheel derivation rules, and connector audits. That methodological posture is scientifically important in its own right. It means the architecture presents itself not as a protected symbolic system, but as one that claims vulnerability to recalculation and comparison. If maintained rigorously, that gives the doctrine a stronger scientific posture than many pattern-based proposals usually possess. The UN group architecture would also have scientific impact because it could encourage a broader rethinking of how complex recurrence systems are analyzed. In many sciences, repeated events are studied through frequency, periodicity, or statistical regularity. The UN group doctrine suggests another possibility, that recurrence systems may also contain hidden topologies, internal grouping laws, sequence grammars, and position-linked return structures. If this way of thinking proved fruitful in eclipse studies, it could have broader scientific value as a model for how to search for deeper organization in other cyclical natural systems. There is also a likely impact on the philosophy and practice of scientific verification. The UN group doctrine, if engaged seriously, would require scientists to distinguish carefully between several layers. What is observationally established? What is structurally inferred? What is explanatory? And what remains interpretive? That distinction is scientifically healthy. It encourages a more disciplined treatment of unconventional models where neither immediate dismissal nor premature acceptance is adequate. The work would therefore not only contribute a possible new structure, it would also test the scientific community's capacity to evaluate large, layered, visually strong doctrines with precision rather than reflex. Finally, if the UN group doctrine were verified at core levels, it could affect scientific culture by reopening the possibility that major hidden structures may remain inside long-studied datasets. This is scientifically important because it shifts attention from the idea that mature fields are nearly exhausted to the idea that known data may still contain undisclosed architecture. In that sense, the UN group work would not only contribute to eclipse science, it would become an example of how scientific understanding can deepen not only by discovering new objects, but by discovering new order within objects already known.